After completing my literature review, I thought it would be interesting to ask a Year 12 student from my school what she thought of fairness in assessment means. Her response was, fairness in assessment means that teachers need to differentiate their time amongst students. That is, they should spend more time with students who take longer to grasp concepts and less time with students who pick concepts up quickly. It is also about teachers sticking to the guidelines and being consistent and students sticking to the rules by handing in assessments on time and not gaining an unfair advantage over others. Interestingly, in her response, I identified 5 of the 6 principles that are mentioned in this literature review. My review covers a broad area in relation to fairness in assessment, which needs to be narrowed down to answer the following question. What can schools and teachers do to ensure fairness in assessment? The first principle to ensure fairness in assessment is to make sure that assessments are valid and reliable. Some research that I found indicated that there is a margin for error in all large-scale standardised tests, and test scores in high-stakes testing, such as the HSC, are not free from errors of measurement, which can adversely affect students when relying on an ATAR to enter university. Considering that assessment marks can influence the HSC final examination, consistency of teacher judgment becomes extremely important. The second principle is to ensure that assessment procedures are fair and equitable. Research by Scott indicated that assessments should be differentiated to accommodate all students. Rouse and Barrow suggested that families' socioeconomic background can affect educational outcomes, but students from low socioeconomic backgrounds perform better when they attend schools in high socioeconomic areas. This is why publishing school results on my school's website places increased pressure on schools to improve their performance, which can increase the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Schools should implement policy to ensure that resources, materials and procedures make provisions for differences in context, cultural and regional differences. The third principle to ensure fairness in assessment is to include all learners. Rouse and Barrow suggested that economically advantaged parents spend more on their children's education compared to economically disadvantaged parents, resulting in increased gaps in their learning for these children. The Department of Education and Communities has introduced RAM funding, which is attempting to address the learning gaps for students in low SES areas. The fourth principle to ensure fairness in assessment is that it should emphasise and promote learning. Research by Scott suggested that good assessment design is reinforced when information gained from classroom-based standardised testing is accurate, useful and aligned to teaching objectives, and that assessment frequency, intrusiveness and intensity should not be overwhelming for students and their families. The fifth principle is to ensure fairness in assessment, and that is through being appropriately planned and prepared. Teachers are required to plan assessments so that tasks are differentiated for all students, as required by the Every Student, Every School educational reform. This reform requires teachers to adjust learning programs and assessments to accommodate all students, regardless of their abilities. Students with learning needs are required to have an education plan that should be followed by every teacher. Adequate planning requires that assessment tasks are communicated and explained effectively to students so that they understand what is required of them. The sixth principle to ensure fairness in assessment is that it should assist teachers in knowing their students. Van Uwick suggested that teachers who know their students will be less likely to discriminate in their expectations of student achievement. Research by Scott suggests that knowing our students is important to ensure fairness in assessment practices, as we are less likely to have perceptions that are too low for students with disabilities and students who are gifted not being appropriately challenged. And finally, communication of assessment results must be understandable to all stakeholders. If teachers want to be fair to their students, they need to use assessment for the purpose of getting to know their students' strengths and weaknesses so that feedback becomes meaningful. Finally, I interviewed a head teacher and asked her what fairness in assessment meant to her, which again covered most of the principles discussed in this paper. Her response was as follows: fairness in assessment is making sure that all students have the opportunity to express themselves through their learning and gain additional understanding through research. Assessment should involve providing a wide variety of tasks using Bloom's taxonomy to assess a wide variety of skills, as students have different strengths. So tasks should be centred around using literacy, visual skills, physical demonstrations, or incorporating technology. Students should be provided with a scope and sequence at the beginning of the year. Tasks should be varied and provide opportunities for students to demonstrate a variety of skills. The nature of the task should be linked to the units of work and the related outcomes with marking criteria provided. Teachers should follow malpractice and plagiarism practices to ensure fairness, and modelling of tasks should take place to ensure greater understanding.